Hi, my name's Charlotte Reeves and I'm from Learn Pet Photography, where we focus on shooting and editing education for pet photographers. So I have a private Facebook group called Realshoots Complete Course, and it is full of all my lovely reel shooters, I call them. So these are people who have enrolled in my Realshoots Complete course, which is a series of 10 tutorials based on real life pet photography sessions. Now, as part of the Realshoots community, we do a monthly challenge called Edit My Photo, where I post a raw file of an image that I've taken and my reel shooters edit the file and then post it. Each time I choose a winner, so I choose my favorite edit out of everyone's edits, and then it turns back on them, so they can then submit one of their images to me to edit. So this image was submitted by Cassie because she was the winner of the Juno editing challenge. So this was a dog called Juno. It was a silhouette, and this is what the raw file looked like. So very murky, quite underexposed. It's a silhouette, but it definitely needed some work to bring out the potential. And the edit that Cassie did was this. Isn't it absolutely beautiful? I loved it, and I awarded Cassie the winner of that particular Edit My Photo challenge. So this is the image that Cassie has submitted to us, and I really love the resulting image when I edited it. So I thought it was worth sharing with everybody so they could see how you can turn an image that has a lot of potential into a fully realized work of art. Now, she wasn't quite sure what to do with the greens in particular in this image. It looks like there's a few sort of autumn fall colors in the background, a few sort of oranges and reds and browns. I do really like the greens in there, so I don't want to turn all those greens into those oranges and reds and browns. So what I want to do, so my aim for this edit, obviously do the leash removal and the removal of this over here. But what I wanted to do with the colors and the color scheme with this is actually bring out those autumn tones in the background more, and also enhance those greens a little bit more, and probably fix up this area of grass where there's quite a bit of dead grass mixed in with the green grass there, and it's kind of dragging the look of the grass down. So I want to try and do something about that as well. So let's dive into the edit. So I've got the raw file here in Adobe Lightroom, and what I'm planning on doing is doing two separate edits in Lightroom and then combining them in Photoshop. So I'm going to do the edit for the overall image first to get the dog looking good, because if we start messing with those colors in the background, we're also going to mess with the colors in the dog. There's some pretty similar tones in there, those oranges and yellows. So I'm going to edit first to get the dog looking good. So I'm going to whip through this. This is a really good exposure, by the way. It's a great starting point. It's a nice sharp image. It's a really great capture of this dog in action. So I really love that about this shot. Looking at the histogram here, you can see that it's very well exposed. There are no clipped shadows or highlights, which is great. So we have a little tiny gap at the bottom of the histogram and a little tiny gap at the top, but not very much at all. So mainly what I'm going to be wanting to do with this image is just increase the contrast and get a bit more color and definition. So I'm just going to whip through this super quickly, bringing the highlights down, the whites up. That helps increase contrast in the lighter tones of the image, and then bringing the shadows up and the blacks down. And that helps increase the contrast in the darker areas of the image. I'm also going to add a bit of extra clarity and some vibrance as well. That will help to bring out those nice tones in the background. Now, I'm having to be very careful here because this image was exposed so well. I don't want to mess that up because there is actually detail in the bright highlights on the dog's fur, and I don't want to lose that detail. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more than I normally would and kind of look in this area. If we hit backslash on the keyboard to go back to the before image, there is definitely detail in these bright areas. We don't want to lose that. I'm actually going to grab the adjustment brush and just go over, turn the overlay on so I can see where I'm going, and just go over these areas here that have maybe a tendency to lose detail when I take those whites up. I think they're the main areas. Oh, a little bit in the ear here as well. Turn the mask overlay off, and then just bring the highlights down in those areas, and also maybe the exposure just a tiny little bit. Okay, so that's brought those back under control again. So zooming back out, and if we go before and after. I've definitely got a lot more contrast and interest in the image now. I'm actually just going to take the exposure up a little bit too, and just have a bit of a fiddle around with these tones a little bit more, just to make sure I'm really getting some good contrast. The white balance in this image is actually pretty spot on to start with. So another thing I'm going to try and do is deal with these couple of little blue patches on the dog. So these are actually caused by those parts of the dog being in shade. So if I go down to the HSL panel here in Lightroom, and I'm going to go to saturation, I'm going to use the little selector tool here and then click and drag on the image in the areas where I can see that blue cast. So I'm just going to click and drag down and see how that's actually picked up blue and a little bit of purple in those areas. And if I do a before and after, you'll see it deals with that really nicely. Just makes it not quite so obviously blue in those little shaded parts. So I think the dog's looking pretty good in this edit. I'm quite happy with that. Now, I'm really wanting to bring those tones out in the background, but if I do that, I know I'm going to mess with the appearance of the dog. So what I'm actually going to do is create a virtual copy. You could also just save a snapshot in the history, but I find a virtual copy is a little bit easier to work with because you can kind of flick between the two and it's got the two edits very separate. So I'll just right click on the file here and go create virtual copy. Now it's created the virtual copy with the edits that I've already made. So that's probably a good starting point, but I'm really going to have to mess with these colors in the background to try and get them looking good. So what I want to do is change the hues of the greeny yellows in the background. So I'm going to grab the little selector here and I'm going to click on the image, probably on this sort of color. I'll just zoom out again. And I'm going to just click and drag down. And that's changed those tones. If you have a look at the sliders moving over under the hue adjustment in that HSL panel, you can see those tones kind of going a little bit more orange. Okay, and then once you've finished with that selector, you can actually go in and have a bit of a play around with those sliders manually. The selector is really good for seeing what colors are actually there, because you might think it looks like red, but it's actually yellow, or you might think it looks like yellow, but it's actually green. So using that selector to start with can be really good. Once you see what colors are there, then you can go and mess with the sliders yourself. So I'm just going to, and see how this is affecting the dog quite badly, but we're not going to be worried about that because we're not using the dog in this image. Oranges, oh, that orange one, yeah, there we go, starting to get some red. So if I move this orange slider, that starts to get some really nice reds in the background there. And the red slider, yeah, there's not really any reds in there to begin with, so it's mainly the orange and yellow. Now if I move the green, I actually kind of want to keep the green bushes in the background because I feel like it's a nice contrast, so I'm not going to mess with that too much. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So let's have a look at that compared to the edit that we've done for the dog. See the difference there? We've really brought out those kind of orangey red tones. It's going to have a little bit more of a tweak. We're going to tweak this further in Photoshop as well. And I'm wondering if a little bit of a white balance adjustment might work well here too, just to kind of increase the intensity of those warm tones in the image. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Okay, so I'm now going to export this image, and that's going to be our base image that we're going to be working on in Photoshop. So I'm going to export that as a PSD file, and then I'm going to open up the other one, so the virtual copy. I'm just going to open that in Photoshop. So I'm just going to export this one. I'm just going to use my export preset here that I have set up called Export for Editing. It puts the image in a subfolder called Final and adds it back into the catalog. Also opens it up in Photoshop. So I'm going to export that one. And then I'm going to go back into Lightroom and select this one here. And I'm just going to not export that one. I'm just going to open that in Photoshop. So Command E. So now in Photoshop, we've got both of these images, same image, two different edits. I'm going to add this one as a layer into this one. So I'm going to make sure the move tool is selected, and I'm going to click, drag up to that tab, and then drop into this image. So we'll end up with two identical image layers, but with different edits. So that should snap and align perfectly. So now I'm going to add a mask to this top layer here, and I'm going to add a black mask because I want to mask it all out so I can then mask in the areas that I do want. So I'm going to hold down Option and click the Add Mask in the Layers palette there. Now that's hidden everything in that layer there, and to reveal parts of that layer there, I'm going to select a white brush, press B on the keyboard, it'll take you to the brush. I'm going to make the brush quite large, and then I'm going to just paint in the areas where I want to bring out those red sort of tones, and it's mostly just going to be in the background here. So I'm just kind of going through here and adding that in. Now I don't want to mess with the greens in the background too much because I kind of like the interplay of the greens with those reds. I think that looks quite cool. And I also don't really want to mess with the grass as well, because if I start painting in this over the grass, it's going to turn the grass kind of a bit of a yucky color, and we don't really want to do that. So it's mainly just a background there. I'm just going to go in and make sure that I haven't gone over the edges of the dog, and I'm just going to mask that back off the dog. So you can press backslash on the keyboard, and that will show you where your mask is going. So I'm going to make sure I have a black brush selected. I'm going to make this brush a bit smaller. Okay, now I've just left a little bit of an edge there because I don't think that the changes are going to really apply to the edge of that, and I'd rather do it that way than have a little halo where the two different colors are. So I'm going to turn that mask off, zoom out a little bit, turn that layer on and off so you can see the difference there. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm just going to make sure it's not doesn't bleed onto the grass down here. So using a black brush, just making sure it's off the grass there. Don't want it on the grass. Okay. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. We're going to do a little bit more tweaking to it yet, but for now, that's good. So I'm going to flatten that. And the next thing I'm going to do just really quickly is go in here and remove this leash. So I like using the polygon selection tool to create straight edged selections, especially when you've got the leash here that is very, very straight. Because trying to draw a straight line with, say, the patch tool or just the regular marquee tool can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. So look how quick and easy that was. All right, and I'm going to use content aware fill here. So just press delete on the keyboard, content aware, click OK, and there it goes. So deselect that. Now, there's maybe a couple of little spots I need to fix up manually here, and my preferred method for doing that is using the clone stamp tool. So I'm just going to fix up wherever I can see a bit of an anomaly. Sometimes when you use content aware, it will leave evidence of its passing. So I think that's fixed that up. Now I also want to remove this, I guess, box over here. So I'm just going to use that straight edge selection tool again to create the selection, and then content aware fill. That does a pretty good job there. I'm just going to manually fix up this little section on the edge here. There we go. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, so we've removed those distractions. That's pretty good. While we're at it, there's a bit of a funny kind of distracting leaf here. I'm going to get rid of that one. It's created a bit of a duplicate there. Get rid of that. Anything else distracting? All right, so I think I've gotten rid of all the distractions. I think I might also just straighten this in Photoshop as well. Sometimes I'd wait until I go back to Lightroom to do any cropping and straightening, but it's kind of just distracting and annoying me, so I'm going to just do it now. So crop tool with C. And the good thing about cropping in Photoshop is that you can use content-aware crop, so you can actually crop outside the bounds of the image, which is super handy, and Photoshop will just fill in those little edges there where you've cropped outside the image. You just have to make sure that content aware is ticked in the settings up there for the crop tool. All right, so that crop has been quite successful. That's looking good. Now let's have a look at this background again. I think there's still some greenish sort of tones in there that I'd like to fix up. So what I'm going to do is go to select color range, and it brings up this little dialog box here, and I'm going to click in the image on the specific color that I want to select, and it's that sort of greeny yellow that's still persistent in the background here. There we go, and see, it's given us an overlay of where that color is present in the image. Now we can always fix this up later, and the fuzziness is basically, it's a bit of a funny term, but fuzziness is basically shows how much on either side of that exact tone that it's going to select. So a wide range on either side of that tone, or a very narrow range on either side. So I'm going to take the fuzziness up a little bit. I think that's pretty much covered it. Now it is selecting parts of the dog and the grass, but we can go in and fix that up. So I'm going to go OK, and it's basically made a selection here for us. So what am I going to do with this selection? I'm going to use hue saturation to change the colors in there. So I'm going to create an adjustment layer using this selection to create the mask. So it's pretty easy. All you have to do is make sure you've got something selected, and then go in here and create an adjustment layer. So hue saturation, and it will use that selection to create that mask. Now we don't want the adjustments we're about to do to apply to anything else other than that background area. So looking at the actual mask and what parts of it are applying to the image. So looking at that mask, we need to make sure the dog and the grass are all masked out. So I'm going to just paint into this mask with a black brush, just so we can remove the areas we don't want the adjustment that we're going to make to apply to. So that's made sure that the dog and the grass is masked out. The only areas that we're going to actually affect are going to be these areas that are not masked. So now I'm going to go into the properties for the hue saturation, and I'm going to use a little selector here, and I'm going to click and drag to be a bit more saturated, and also to change the hue. So I'm going to take that slider down to make those areas a bit more red. So it's actually chosen the reds to adjust, and we're making them a bit more red. Now I also think maybe there's some yellows in there. Yeah, there is. So I'm going to take the hue of the yellows down a little bit as well. Now we don't want to make all of the tones in the background just red. We want to have a nice little mottled variation of tones in there. Okay, let's turn that layer off and on and see the difference there. See how it's brought out those really lovely red and orange and yellowy sort of autumn tones? That's exactly what we were going for. All right, so now there's a few like hotspots in the background that are a little bit lighter than I would like them to be. So I'm just going to select the background layer, and I'm just going to burn those areas to just darken them off a little bit. So I'm going to select the burn tool over here. Make sure it's set to only 10% exposure. Make it quite a big brush, and I'm just going to burn in some of these really bright areas. And making them a little bit darker will also help to bring out the colors just a little bit more. There we go. I think that sort of toned down the background a little bit. So now let's have a look at the green grass. It doesn't look too bad, but there are definitely dead bits in the grass, and I want to try and get that looking a little bit greener. So I'm going to do the same thing again using the color range selection. So select color range, and I'm going to click where there's brown grass to try and select those brown sort of tones, which also happen to be exactly the same sorts of tones as the dog itself. So we're going to have to use that to select those brown tones and then mask out those other bits that we don't want to affect. So I'm going to use that selection to create a mask for a hue saturation adjustment layer once again. And then I'm going to turn on the mask overlay, and I'm going to just mask out everything except for those bits of grass that it's selected. So now, whenever we make a change, it's only going to apply to those bits of brown grass. So I'm going to go into the properties for the hue saturation adjustment layer, and I'm just going to click colorize, because what I want to do is actually add some color to those brown bits of grass to make them a bit greener. Now, this will look a bit wrong to start with, but bear with me. I want to get the right tone of green. I don't want to make it too green. There we go. I want to try and sort of match the background green and the colors of green grass that you can see in the foreground as well. And then I'm going to select a blend mode. So at the moment it's normal. I'm going to change it to hue. And it's also still looking a little bit weird. So I'm just going to take the opacity down until it doesn't. So if I take it all the way down, the grass goes back to brown again. If I take it up a little bit, it sort of just starts changing the hue of that brown grass. So it's not quite so obviously brown. We're not turning it green, we're just making it not quite so obviously brown. So if I turn that layer off and on, you'll see the difference that's made there. I think it's not distractingly brown grass now, so that's kind of what we were going for. So while we're at it, I just thought I'd show you another method that you can use to turn brown grass green. You can, I'm just going to turn that layer off, you can create a new layer, get a brush with the green that you want. So I'm going to sample off the foreground green, probably about, I don't know, about there maybe. I'm going to brush over the areas where I want the brown grass to be green. I'm doing this kind of roughly around the dog here. And then change the color mode to color, and then reduce the opacity. So you see the difference there where I did it and where I didn't do it. I didn't do it up close to the dog. Let me just paint into this with this green all the way up to the edges of the dog. That's the difference there. So whether you use the hue saturation layer method or the painting over the top method, which I will take the opacity down a little bit more, I think, to make it look a bit more realistic. It's kind of up to you. But there's two different methods for basically achieving the same thing. So I think I like the hue saturation layer mask effect the best. I'm just going to take that down a little bit more. I think that's pretty good. So let's do a bit of a check and see what the image looked like when we first brought it in. So that was just an initial edit for the dog, and see what that looks like now. How's that? We've got a really cool, vibrant, autumny looking kind of background, which I really love. Now that I'm happy with those adjustments to the background and the grass, I'm just going to flatten the image. I generally do this after I finish messing around, just to keep the file size small and keep the number of layers a little bit lower, rather than having 30 billion layers that I'm having to keep track of. So I'm going to flatten that. So to finish this image off in Photoshop, I'm going to run my polish up action. So what this action does is basically create a bunch of layers with different adjustments so that I can kind of fine tune and tweak the image. And all of the different adjustments also have masks, so I can apply those final adjustments to just single areas of the image instead of the whole image. So as part of this polish up action, it actually creates an eye sparkle bit. So I'm going to go into the eyes. I think they're pretty sparkly already because this dog's running into full sun, so they're pretty sparkly eyes to begin with. I'm just going to add a little bit of extra sharpening there, making sure I have the white brush selected. All that's really done, that polish up action, is just added a little bit of extra vibrance, saturation, contrast, that kind of thing. I really would like the greens to stand out a little bit more too, because I like the interplay of the greens with the autumn colors. So I'm just going to create an extra adjustment layer here, hue saturation adjustment layer. So I'm just going to use the little selector here and click and drag on the image. I'm going to put it on greens, but it might select yellows, so we'll see. So if I go click and drag, oh no, that's done greens. That's good. So I'm just going to take that saturation up of those greens a little, turning all these final adjustments off and on again. You can see it's just added a bit more contrast and color and life to the image. So I'm going to flatten that. There's just one more thing that I want to do, and that is deal with this tear staining and color around the muzzle a little bit more. So I have another action that I have set up in Photoshop called tear staining removal. All it basically does is create a hue saturation adjustment layer with a black mask that I can then paint into with a white brush to deal with this kind of orangey staining around mouths and eyes that you get sometimes. So I don't want to touch the dog's nose and lips because they're red and that is the color that they are meant to be. I just want to reduce the intensity of that tear staining. So if I turn that off and on again, and you'll see in the properties for that hue saturation adjustment layer, in the reds, it takes the saturation down and the lightness up. And in the yellows, it also does the same thing. And that is enough to kind of take the edge off any tear staining. So I'm going to zoom out to 100% and make sure that looks okay before I commit that layer. Okay, so I'm just going to take the opacity down to like 70%. Because taking all the color out just does not look natural. So you need to be a little bit subtle with it. Okay. I think that's pretty good. Right, so I'm going to flatten that, and then I'm going to go back into Lightroom and have another tiny little tweak, and then we should be done. Okay, so here we are back in Lightroom. We've got the version of the image, which is a PSD file that we've been playing around with in Photoshop. We've also got the original edit and also the virtual copy where we edited the image for the background. And then we've got this version, which is so bright and happy, and I love it. So when I bring images back into Lightroom, I always find that's a good opportunity to check the histogram to make sure the edits that I've done in Photoshop haven't reduced the contrast in the image and gotten rid of all that lovely contrast that we created when we edited the raw file. So looking at the histogram here, I can see that there is a bit of a gap at the top of the histogram, which kind of shows that the bright parts of the image aren't quite as bright as they could be. So the image doesn't have quite as much contrast as it could to properly fulfill its tonal potential. So I'm going to take the whites up just a bit so that those tones kind of slide up to the right on the histogram there. And then just balance that out with the highlights down a little bit, as I always do. Now I'm going to zoom in and check on the dog to make sure I'm not losing detail in these important areas where the highlights are brightest on the dog's fur. That's all looking quite good. So I'm not too worried about that. I'm also just going to take the blacks down a little bit just to make sure I've got some proper blacks in there. Maybe take the overall exposure up just a tad. I'm going to check those highlights again. Yeah, I'm just starting to lose those areas there. So I'm going to go to an adjustment brush. I'm going to use auto mask, and I'm just going to select, turn on overlay. I'm just going to select these really bright bits here, just so I can bring them back again. Okay, turn the overlay off and then just take the highlights down just a bit, just to make sure I'm getting detail back in those areas. It's all about having detail in the highlights as well. So the main histogram may tell you that you haven't blown out any areas, but if you've lost detail in the highlight, it's not going to tell you that. So you need to go in and actually have a really close look. So zooming back out again, I'm just going to step back, have a little look away for a little bit, talk to my puppy. Opal would like to say hello. Opal, say hello. Give me a kiss. Good girl. Okay, I'm gonna have a look out the window over here. So that might seem a bit crazy to you and you might think that I've gone nuts in the middle of editing this, but the reason that I do that is because when you've been looking at something for too long, you can kind of get used to the way it looks and you fail to see any errors or anything wrong with the image because your eyes and your brain are working together to normalize what you're seeing. So by going away, looking out the window, looking at something else, preferably in daylight, you can come back, look at the image with fresh pair of eyes and really pick up on if there's any color casts or any weirdness going on in the image that you failed to detect before. So coming back to this shot, I think it looks pretty good. I'm reasonably happy with that. So let's have a look at a proper before and after. So if we go back to the original image and I'll click reset on that edit so you can see what it looked like completely raw. So that was the completely raw image. So really, really good starting point. So nice work, Cassie. And then the edit. Oh my gosh, it's so bright and colorful. So that's kind of what I was really wanting to go for with this image. I was wanting to have a really nice, I guess, contrast, but also a pretty color scheme between the green of the grass and the bushes in the background, while also bringing some more autumn sort of tones through. And I'm just going to do one more thing to finish this off, and that's add a little bit of post-crop vignetting, just to darken those edges a bit, bring the attention towards the middle. Yeah. Maybe move the midpoint a bit. Yeah, I like that. Okay, really cool. So the changes that we made in Lightroom just now. So this is when I first brought it back into Lightroom from Photoshop. And then this is with the slight tonal tweaks and the vignette added. So it's really kind of brought your attention right to the center of the image and that dog and that super joyous expression on the dog's face, because that's what it's all about. Awesome. I hope you've really enjoyed this. It's been a little bit of a long editing tutorial, but I feel like I've packed in quite a lot there. If you've got any questions, post them in the comments. Love to hear from you. And remember, if you want to get involved in the Realshoots community, all you need to do is enroll in the Realshoots complete course. I'll post a link below, and you can join us in the Facebook group and participate in these super fun challenges that we do every month. So I hope to see you there, and until next time, take care and I'll catch you later. Bye.